Hi, and welcome to the third and last session of the ViViMaT workshop. Also, welcome to the jungle. My name is Stefan Eder, and I'll be your host. Although, people have insinuated that they prefer my kids to host more. Not really sure how I should take this. So, here to introduce our first speaker is my daughter, Gwen.
Lars Pastewka is professor for simulation at the Department of Microsystems Engineering at the University of Freiburg. He uses computer simulations at atomic and mesoscopic scales to study mechanical processes. He's particularly interested in unveiling the fundamental mechanisms underlying contact, adhesion, and friction. Lars got his PhD in physics from the University of Freiburg for research carried at Fraunhofer IWM. He held a postdoc position at Johns Hopkins University and headed a junior research group at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology before joining the University of Freiburg as faculty in 2017. Lars has held several fellowships, received an Emmy Noether Award and an ERC starting grant. He will be telling us about pattern formation in sliding metallic contacts.
Hello and welcome to my talk on pattern formation in sliding metallic contacts. Let me start actually by thanking Stefan and Carsten for organizing such a nice virtual materials tribology workshop. I guess it's a bit of an unusual format, pre-recording these slides, the talk, and then discussing afterwards, but I really like the idea and the fact that we haven't been really able to meet for almost the last year, and probably it won't happen at least until sort of maybe the beginning or mid next year. These unusual times certainly call for unusual ways of disseminating results, and I think this is a very interesting format. So I'll talk about pattern formation in plasticity, essentially what happens underneath the sliding contact, and I would also like you to invite to look at Martin Dienwiebel's talk within this ViViMaT series on materials tribology. He's talking about related things from a more experimental perspective. I'm a theoretician, a computational physicist, a computational material scientist, and will look at these pattern formation processes from the viewpoint of computer simulations. So this is a materials tribology series. So most of you are familiar with tribological systems and will have seen a picture like this. So we have two surfaces that push on top of each other with a force F, and they slide relative to each other with a velocity v, and then of course things happen right at the interface. It may be lubricated, maybe not lubricated, so these interfaces slip along with respect to each other. But what I would like to talk about today is not the interface itself, but rather what's happening in sort of this subsurface region, the region below really the interface region where the sliding motion happens. So what happens there is, of course, that part of the energy is dissipated through the subsurface region by ways of plastic deformation or other changes in the material, other permanent changes in the material. And what I've just pulled up here is a cartoon from some older work of David Rigney that sort of illustrates what's going on. So there's of course a bulk material on the bottom, but then there's a region that is here called plastically deformed, in which plastic deformation essentially occurs in a laminar manner. So if I'm looking at this dashed red line here, then because of the action of the frictional force, it will plastically deform according to these black lines here, essentially in a laminar manner. And then on top there is this region that is called very highly deformed, and something is happening here that is not laminar plastic flow, something that is more complicated. For example, the material may accommodate the grain size, and other things can happen in that region. And what I would like to show you today, that plastic flow in general is not a laminar process. And so this idea of laminar deformation of the subsurface region can only hold in a sort of near the bulk material where strains are small. And in this highly strained interface, near interface region, something else is happening. One problem understanding what's happening is, of course, that you need a way to measure the strains introduced into the surface. And that is difficult in general because essentially you need a tracer that allows you to track the deformation of the material. And a very neat class of systems that actually have sort of a tracer built in are metallic multi-layer systems. And what you see on this slide is an example of a copper-gold system that has nice contrast in electron microscopy. So you can nicely identify these individual copper and gold layers that have been sputter deposited on top of each other. These are experiments carried out by Ruth Schweiger, then at KIT. And what she did is she took these nanolaminates or metallic multi-layer systems, in this case with a layer thickness here of 100 nanometers. There's others that go down to 25 nanometers layer thickness. And then she used a nano indenter to slide on top of it. What you see on the right here is this is a sliding direction. So this is actually a cross section that's perpendicular to the sliding direction. And after sliding a couple of times, 100 cycles in this case, she took a cross section of these films, and what you see is really the deformation profile. So these initial straight lines between these layers have been deformed into this intricate pattern that looks a little bit like what we see in the formation of clouds. So down here, there's this, of course, this picture of Van Gogh, and then a photograph of the formation of clouds. And the reason that clouds actually show this pattern is because of a Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, which is an instability that occurs at the interface of two regions that flow with different streaming velocities and at high Reynolds numbers. And it's very difficult to believe that this Kelvin-Helmholtz type of instability would also occur for metals that, if you were able to describe them with a viscosity, would certainly not be in a high Reynolds number limit, but because the viscosity would be very high. So we thought there must be some sort of atomic scale a mechanism that leads to the formation of these vortices, and started to use computer simulations to look at this. And I would like to tell you now what we find and what we had to do in order to reproduce these vortex patterns. We started out with a very naive way of running these calculations. So we simply set up a system consisting of this multi-layer material. So what you see here in red, so these are the gold atoms. What you see in blue, these are the copper atoms. And the interaction is with an embedded atom method potential that we actually tuned specifically for this purpose. And then we use a rigid indenter so this indenter here to push into the surface and scratch the surface and slide onto the surface. So I'll just show you a video what happens. So the indenter sinks into the surface, and then it starts sliding, and it pushes away the gold and the copper layer. It sinks a little faster into the gold layer because it's a softer material, but it also penetrates the copper material, and it always pushes a little bit of either gold or copper to the side. And you see that this leads to the creation of these hillocks on both sides of the simulation domain. So this is nice, but this is certainly not what I've shown you before from the experiments, but it looks a lot like what you actually see in nano indentation experiments. So you see the formation of these what they call shear bands. So these region here where actually the material folds over, and this looks a lot like what we are seeing in this region here or in this region here. So it's not that far away from the experiment, but it's not the explanation for the formation of these vortices. So what's happening here is, of course, that the radius of our indenter, so if this is our indenter, then the indenter radius is on the order of the thickness of the layers that we have, while the experiment from Ruth Schweiger's group that I've shown you before used an indenter that was much, much larger than the layer spacing. And so it's reasonable to assume that for an indenter that's very large, that the stress in a subsurface region where the material deforms, so let's look at what I've drawn here on the slide as sort of a representative volume element, that the stress in this representative volume element is actually constant. And so we simply use a periodic box in order to model this system. So this is our initial state, and we said that, okay, let's do the following, and we need to do this first step that I'm explaining now in order to reproduce the vortex formation. The indenter actually pushes into the surface, so the first step of the whole deformation is actually a compression of these individual layers. And you see that during this compression, the interface that was straight initially has become wavy or rugged or rough. So there's formation of interface roughness simply because of the fact that I'm compressing this multi-layer stack, that I'm compressing it by, I think this is by 50% or something like that. The next step is now shearing this system. So I'm now taking this representative element here and I'm starting to shear it in a deformation mode that's typically called simple shear, so simply volume conserving shear. So this is what's happening. So the movie that I play in a second will show you on the left-hand side here the shear stress as a function of the strain in the system. So we go up to 300% strain, so strain of 3. This will show you the atomic species, and this picture will change color in a second and show you the local strain rate. So already by looking at the shear stress, you see that this is rather boring. The shear stress essentially remains constant throughout the simulation. And let me run this calculation now. You see this little red cross here on the left tells us where we are in the simulation. You see that something happens in the system, it's shearing. But if you look at this plot of the local strain rate, then you realize that essentially all the strain accommodates at the interfaces somewhere here at the interface between the two layers. This makes sense. I haven't really talked about lattice orientation, but down here I'm telling you that the surface normal orientation, the normal to the interface is actually the 111 lattice plane, and that's an easy slip plane for this FCC material. So it makes sense that it can deform easily at these interfaces where dislocations exist, misfit dislocation exists between these two crystal lattices that have slightly different lattice constants. So what we needed to do actually is to tilt this lattice, and we need this tilt in addition to the interface roughness that we get from the initial compression of this multi-layer stack. So neither of the two alone works in order to stabilize this vortex instability. So why do we think we need both? So let's think about the dislocation that's moving on these 111 planes. So if these are perfectly oriented, so parallel to the interface, then the dislocation will move parallel to the interface. It will never hit the interface. If we have this tilted lattice, then a dislocation here that moves on the 111 plane will eventually, let's look at the dislocation here, will eventually hit the interface, and of course the interface, the lattice constant changes, and in this case the interface is a little more complicated. There's lots of defects at the interface, so there's obstacles at the interface that hinder the motion of the dislocation. And this is essentially hardens the material. The dislocation gets stuck at the interface, and then the system needs to react with something else. And what it will do is it will start creating a slip plane that is sits somewhere on another 111 system that's not aligned with the interface. So this is what you see down here is the same as above. Here we again have the stress versus strain, and you already see that something else is happening. So we have an increase in shear stress, then some sort of instability where it drops down to a plateau value, and this plateau value here actually is identical to the value that we have seen in the system above. So you can already imagine that this shearing here will again be accommodation of the strain at the interfaces between the layers. But let's look what's happening in the first part of this calculation. So again, you see that the system deforms. Now the stress slowly creeps up. You can see that the misalignment of the interfaces, you can see by the way the strain is accommodated here. But the interesting point is when our calculation hits this point of instability up here, which is going to happen about now. And what you start seeing now is you see the occurrence of waviness. So you see that there's sort of this wave that starts developing in the interface of our system. So you see here clearly this waviness that also the experiment has shown, that I've shown you before. So in order to stabilize this, we need this lattice tilt and we need the initial interface roughness. So let's look in a little more detail what's actually going on, and I'll again show you a video of the calculation with atomic species up here, local strain on the top right, that's what you've already seen. And what's new is that I will show you the lattice orientation down here. So this is a color coding. This little triangle tells you the color coding of the video on the left-hand side. So this tells us a lattice orientation. So example, this initial lattice orientation has a 1-1-1 texture. So it's somewhere on these sides of the triangle. And what's shown down here is a heat map of lattice orientations in this system. So we can see the typical the mean or the distribution of orientations in this system. So let me run this. So again, at the beginning, nothing very fancy happens, but then as soon as the instability hits, you see that there is a large region here that actually starts rotating. So we have something like grain rotation, except it's not really grain rotation because it spans over more than one of these multi-layers. And this exactly what's happening is initially you see the formation of a twin on a lattice plane that is not aligned with the interface, and sort of this gives rise to a shear band, a slip band on this plane, and this accommodates the rotation of the grain. So let's look at this again, and maybe now look at this heat map of the orientations. Let me run the video again. You see initially we have something that's close to 1-1-1 texture. Then we develop a broad texture. This is when the grain rotates. A broad distribution of textures. And then towards the end of the calculation, we go back to something that is clearly a 1-1-1 texture where most of the system is oriented with a 1-1-1 texture in the direction normal to the original interfaces, and this then again leads to an accommodation of the strain on 1-1-1 lattice planes, on these easy slip planes that you see here. To summarize, what we need to stabilize these vortex instabilities is first of all the compression of the system. So this compression here that's shown here, it's important because it creates interface roughness. Then we start shearing it, and we need a tilt of the lattice orientation, so of the 1-1-1 lattice orientation, so that the dislocations that slip in the system, that move in the system, get pinned at the interfaces between the multi-layers, and this then stabilizes the vorticities that you see here in the experiments or down here in our simulations. And you see that these simulations actually look very much like what you see in the experiments. So this is, I would say, at least from a phenomenological perspective, quite convincing. Let me point out that we are not the only ones to have looked at this. So these experiments by Ruth Freiger that I've shown in the beginning were the first to actually see these vortex instabilities, at least to the best of my knowledge. There's other experiments that have followed. One example is shown here. This is out of KIT from Horst Hahn's group, where they did a high pressure torsion experiment on, in this case, thick silver copper foils. So these are foils that are stacked on top of each other, and aluminum and copper foils. The thickness is on the order of a couple of 100 microns. So significantly thicker than the 100 nanometers that I've shown you before. And they also see similar patterns developing in these high pressure torsion experiments. What they did to explain this is actually a CFD, computational fluid dynamics calculation, where they assumed that there is a contrast in viscosity between the silver and the copper, or the aluminum and the copper layers. And this also leads to patterns that are similar to what you've seen before. Now, let me say that this calculation and these experiments may be in a different regime, because within a foil of 100 micron, of course, the deformation mechanisms will be different than in a system that consists of layers that are 10 to 100 nanometers in thickness. So this is an alternative explanation that may not be applicable to these very small nanoscale layers that I've shown you before, but they seem to work for these microscale layers that you see here. In the beginning of my talk, I already told you to also look at Martin Dienwiebel's ViViMaT talk, because he has also looked at very similar processes. In this case, this is a multi-layer system, again the same size as what I've discussed here, 10 to 100 nanometers thickness, sputter deposited, but it's a slightly different system. It's gold nickel, and gold nickel is non-miscible in contrast to the copper gold system that I've talked about before, which is miscible. But in these experiments, what Martin sees is something that's very similar to what I've shown you before. So maybe let's look at this figure down here, where you can see that there's an interface region that's intermixed. And while it's not as clear, it doesn't show as clear the formation of these vortices as what I've shown you before, you do see that there's an intermixed region, and then there's an interface essentially that shows a pattern that looks quite similar to what I've shown you before. So this is of course interesting, because by mechanical action you can mix or intermix this non-miscible gold nickel system, and the fact that these patterns look quite similar to what I've shown you before also hint that the deformation mechanism may be similar to what I've shown you in these calculations. Before closing, let me make a final remark, and that is on one implication of these vortices. So if we think about the laminar deformation idea, so if I look at this subsurface region here from this plot or this cartoon that I've also had on one of my first slides, then so laminar flow would mean that an atom or material that sits here can only move parallel to the sliding interface. So there's no mechanism available that would lead to transport perpendicular to the surface. But often you find species that are chemisorbed at the interface or from the lubricant actually inside of the sliding bodies, and often at a depth that is incompatible with purely diffusive processes, transport processes in the bulk. So what I would like to point out is that, of course, the formation of these vortices leads to flow patterns or convective flow patterns that allow the transport of material from the top of the surface into the bulk. And there could be an explanation for why we see chemisorbed species, why we can sort of control what's happening inside of the bulk of a material from the composition of the lubricant. That I'm done, I would like to close. Let me point out that most of the heavy lifting, the calculations, were done by Adrien Goulart. The paper that describes what I've talked about today appeared in Physical Review Materials earlier this year, so I encourage you to look at this if you're interested in it. And of course, I have to thank funding agencies, and also in particular the Gauss Center for Supercomputing, for allocating plenty of computer time to us that allowed us to carry out these calculations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lars. Of course, as an MD guy, I'm a sucker for videos, but I especially appreciated the jumping Larses in the presentation. So, viewers out there, if you want to ask him how he did that, or if you actually have scientific questions, please write them in the comment section below. See you at the next talk.